welcoming you here during Black History Month. I'm happy to talk briefly about Ida B. Wells, who some of you may have heard of. In the late 19th century, when she was barely 30 years old, she was actually the most famous black woman in the world. She was born during the Civil War, at a time when most African Americans were only recent and grew up during a time that was most African Americans were only recently removed from slavery. And it was also a time when blacks needed aggressive leaders who could combat the erosion of black civil rights that took place during Reconstruction and beyond. Ida B. Wells was such a leader, and as a result, she came to be considered by many black leaders to be the logical heir to Frederick Douglass, who I think you guys will be hearing about more next week. They considered Wells' as activist character, brilliant intellect, and leadership skills to be very unusual in a woman, and she often talked to her as a woman who had all the talents and abilities of a man. If Ida B. Wells were a man, one black leader said, she would be a humming independent in politics. She has plenty of nerve and is as sharp as a steel trap. And Ida was, in fact, someone who frequently assumed male roles. As a 16-year-old, she was orphaned and took charge of raising her younger siblings, becoming a teacher and breadwinner in her household, and she survived that experience to go on to become the first African-American woman to own and edit a newspaper. So in writing about her, she's such an unusual person. Part of what I really had to think about is what inspired her and what shaped her thinking and what allowed her to have this uniquely brilliant career. She would become famous for her lifelong crusade about lynching, but it wasn't just pure activism. What she did was fueled by an incisive analysis of the sexual politics of white supremacy that really wasn't anticipated in the work of male thinkers of her day, black or white. So in thinking about what inspired her, I really began to think about the ways in which most of what she does grew out of her experiences as a black woman, which often put her in situations where she really had to question conventional understandings of gender and sexual mores. And she had to do this frequently because Southern notions of chivalry rarely applied to black women, so Wells had to kind of constantly analyze what is chivalry and what is morality. And in doing so, she was also aided by the fact that, unlike a lot of the male thinkers of her day who were college educated and sort of in this sort of dialogue with each other, Wells had a very sort of different kind of education, which she nonetheless drew on. She did not finish high school, but she went to grade school with her slave mother, who went there until she could learn how to read the Bible, and then made Wells and all the other children read the Bible every day. And Wells would always actually draw on the Bible when she was confronted with questions. She had this kind of very straightforward Christianity that wasn't particularly doctrinal. She would go to all the churches to see whose minister was best, and then continue to visit to see if people were keeping up. But nonetheless, she had this strong sense of a kind of very simple activist Christianity. So in terms of how she put this all together, you see when you look at her life these moments where she begins to understand how the world works. And it starts very early, immediately after she's orphaned and takes over the raising of her brothers and sisters. People in the town where she lived begin to question just the fact that she, a 16-year-old young woman, is heading a household. Now she's teaching, she's traveling to another town to teach, but they decide after one day seeing her get some of her father's financial affairs in order by visiting a white man that he had lent some money to, they decide that she's working as a prostitute. And this is very typical of the gender mores of the late 19th century South, when black women were very much under attack and interracial relationships were closely scrutinized. But Wells was so young at this point that she was completely shocked by this experience. She almost really did not know what they were talking about. And would later remember this in her autobiography as the greatest misconstruction this misconstruction as being one of the greatest shocks of her life. What it was in terms of her thinking is it gave her an introduction to the sexually and racially charged public sphere of the postbellum South, which was something that she would be up against again and again. In fact, she becomes a journalist not that many years later, again as a result of the clash with the sort of crazy race and gender politics of the South. She has moved to Memphis and is now traveling to her work as a teacher aboard a commuter train, which was a big innovation at this time. She started her career as a teacher, traveling to work on a mule, but by the late 1890s, they were beginning to finish up the railroads in the South. And in traveling to work on the train, she would ride what was then known as the ladies' car. This was before segregation had fully become codified or even practiced in the South. So she would ride the ladies' car, where women typically liked to ride because back in the day, trains were relatively short and there were usually two passenger cars. One was immediately behind the engine and it flew off smoke and cinder into the passenger car behind it, and women's big skirts could catch on fire. So women wanted to ride in the ladies' car. But this is also the time period when they're beginning to think of separating by race. So Wells got on the ladies' car as usual one day, sat down, got herself settled, and the conductor came by and told her he couldn't take her ticket, that she would have to sit in what was then called the smoking car, that front car. She refused to leave. Ida B. Wells was less than 5 foot tall and probably 25 years old at this point, but she said to him the forward car was a smoker and she intended to stay in the ladies' car. He lost patience. He tried to drag her out. She managed to retain her seat by hanging onto the chair and biting him. Eventually he got 3 other men and they physically lifted her up and carried her out the car. She was left on the wayside, but that did not keep her from going to court and suing. And she actually sued again 4 months later when this happened to her again. And her hope was to try to put a stop to the beginnings of racial segregation that's occurring at this time, especially since when it first began, it really wasn't codified in any way that sort of accounted for where black women would actually sit. There was no black woman's ladies' car. There were just ladies' cars. She sadly would ultimately lose both her suits, but in making them, she received an education in Southern law as it applied to her race and gender that helped teach her to question the meaning of Southern chivalry in ways that would lay foundation for her later work against lynching. In the lower courts, her case was heard by a judge who had fought for the Union, who was actually sympathetic and said that she was clearly a lady, so she should sit in the ladies' car. But when it went to the upper courts where the railroad pursued the case, she was demonized as someone who simply wanted to cause trouble and was sitting in a place where she really didn't belong. This was, for her, an early education in the shifting status of black women under Southern law. Throughout it, she was vilified for simply causing trouble. When she won her lower case, Memphis's white newspaper scoffed, "Darky damsel gets damages," and expressed outrage over what it cost to put a colored teacher in a smoking car. And in the end, she lost because the courts were unwilling to kind of set the precedent for black people to have civil rights in the trains. This was one of the cases that was one of the stops on the way to Plessy versus Ferguson, the famous case that said that accommodations for blacks could be separate but equal, which was another railroad case. And it was a great disappointment to Wells, who saw that this was sort of the end of things. She wrote in her diary after she lost, "I had hoped for such great things from the suit for my people generally. I had firmly believed all along that the law in the world was on our side, and when we appealed to it, it would give us justice. "Oh God, is there no redress, no peace, and no justice in this land for us?" Wells's anguish was very sad, but it also fueled the same anger that had made her do the suit, and inspired her to become a writer and an activist. In her early 20s, when the case began, she was already discontented with teaching. She was very aware she wasn't very well educated herself. And she was also very aware that she could probably do better things. A lot of her students and their parents needed guidance in everyday life. She felt that she wasn't necessarily able to provide it as a teacher, but she felt in writing for newspapers she would be able to put some of her self-education and years of Bible reading to work and become an interpreter of Black life. And that's what she did. She became a journalist calling herself Iola, and eventually did well enough doing that she was able to become a part owner and editor of a newspaper. But that, too, ended tragically in 1892, and her paper, The Free Speech, was destroyed in the aftermath of a brutal lynching in Memphis, Tennessee. It was one of those lynchings that sometimes took place in the South that was all about things going on in town. There was a fight between some boys, Black boys and white boys, that started it, but it was really about the fact that Blacks in Memphis had started a grocery store which was taking business from another white-owned grocery store, and eventually the conflict escalated into a race riot in which 2 men were killed who happened to be friends of Ida B. Wells. For Wells, who wasn't in town when this happened, the whole thing was a revelation. She, like many people, was confused and disturbed by lynchings. Lynchings in the South were almost always explained as having something to do with rape and the need to keep Black men under control. But Wells, in this case, knew for a fact that there was no allegation of rape, that the 2 men that she knew that she had been killed had been Sunday school teachers and pillars of respectability. And she began to investigate lynching, and she found that in most cases of lynching there were in fact no allegations of rape, that there were often these kind of conflicts. And when there was sexual impropriety, it usually was a consensual relationship that someone had found out about and disapproved of. And that's what she began to write about, most notably in a famous editorial where she said that she thought that the real problem behind lynching was that white women were smiling and sort of engaging in relationships with Black men, which led to her paper being destroyed. And it also then led her to take on a lifelong career speaking out against lynching. And in speaking out against lynching, she deconstructed it, what it was basically about. She argued that lynching had nothing to do with rape or concerns about sex. It really had to do with, it was an extra-legal form of violence designed to make Black people live in terror, to keep Blacks under control, to reinforce the power system as needed. And this was the message she took to the world once she was driven out of Memphis and the American South. She traveled north, relocating first to New York and then to Chicago. She traveled abroad. She delivered numerous anti-lynching lectures and also began to publish pamphlets and books chronicling what lynching was about, keeping tabulations of when and where lynchings occurred and investigating the circumstances behind them. Wells's analysis of lynching is still strikingly incisive today, and at the time in the 1890s it made her a celebrity and defined anti-lynching as a cause. Some of what she says seems almost obvious to us today, but it really was revolutionary at the time. And by decoupling lynching from rape and addressing white supremacy as the root cause of lynching, she was able to make lynching into a crime that could be opposed rather than a practice that had previously inspired more uneasiness than than anything else among blacks and required no defense among whites. So, in short, her analysis of lynching was truly path-breaking in its own way, and it was very much based on what she had sort of learned over the course of her young life. And it provides us an important example of someone who, much like the abolitionists who she very much admired and sought to emulate, Wells was someone who managed to change what a significant number of people thought about something. Lynching would obviously not disappear immediately, but it began to be treated more seriously as a crime, especially in the North. It began to have an international reputation as a problem, and the numbers of lynchings actually did begin to go down in the early 20th century after Wells's campaign. Thank you.